everyone, in this video we are going to discuss two important formal fallacies which are illicit major and illicit minor. Moving into the topic, that is illicit major and illicit minor, we will be first looking at the features of a valid argument. So, why we are focusing on the features of a valid argument? A violation in this rules or the features that we are going to discuss is what results in a fallacy. Alright, so here we have the various features of a valid argument. So, here you have the first one. Conclusion will be positive if both the statements are positive. If you consider an argument, if both the premises or both the statements are positive, then obviously the conclusion will be positive. Next one, conclusions will be negative if either of the statements is negative. So, if you consider the statements or the preposition, if either of the statements, any one of the statement is negative, then the conclusion will be obviously negative. That is rule number 2 or the second feature of a valid argument. Third one, there will be no conclusion if both the statements are negative. So, if you have an argument with both the statements or both the premises as negative, then you cannot have a conclusion for that particular premises that you have got. Next, if both premises are universal, then the conclusion must also be universal. So, we know that we have universal and particular statements or prepositions. So, if you consider an argument and both the premises of your argument is universal, then obviously the conclusion must also be universal. Then, if one of the premises is particular, then the conclusion must be particular. Let us say if you have an argument in which the first premise is particular and the second premise is universal, then obviously then your conclusion will be particular because one of the premises or one of the statements is particular. So, obviously the conclusion will be particular. Then, if both the premises are particular, then no conclusion can be drawn from the given premises. So, if you consider an argument in which you have both the premises particular, then there will be no conclusion. That means, if you have an argument where both the premises are particular and you have a conclusion there, then that particular argument is invalid or there is a fallacy in that particular argument. So, that is the sense of these rules or these features that we are discussing here. Next one, the middle term must be distributed least once. That we have already discussed in our previous videos that we have different terms in an argument, or if you consider a syllogism, we have the major term, the minor term and the middle term. So, the next rule that we are focusing here is that the middle term must be distributed at least once. So, we know that the middle term appears in both the premises and it will be absent in the conclusion. So, it should be distributed in either of the premises that are given. So, the next rule is a term that is not distributed in the premises cannot be distributed in the conclusion. So, as I have already mentioned, we have different terms, right. So, a term that is not distributed in the premises cannot be distributed in the conclusion. So, these are the features or these are the rules that should be followed by a valid argument. So, the topic that we are going to discuss in this particular video, the illicit major and the illicit minor. So, these are two important types of formal fallacies. So, that particular fallacies are appearing because they are violating this particular rule that we have discussed here. A term that is not distributed in the premises cannot be distributed in the conclusion. If an argument violates this particular rule, the last rule that we have discussed, that will result in a fallacy either illicit major or illicit minor. So, as an introductory part, this is what I have to mention here. So, this is what we are focusing here. So, in illicit major and illicit minor, what is the rule that is violating? A term that is not distributed in the premises cannot be distributed in the conclusion. So, if you consider this particular feature or this particular rule of a valid argument, you have a term here that is distribution. Right. So, in our previous videos we have already discussed the idea of distribution of terms. So, in order to get a proper idea about this illicit major and illicit minor, I would like to mention this particular idea again in this video, so that you can easily associate this idea with the fallacies that we are going to discuss. Alright. So, what do you mean by this distribution of terms? So, if you consider a preposition, there we have different structure. That means we have a structure for a preposition and we have different elements that are associated with it. So, let us say if you consider a statement or a preposition like this, all dogs are mammals. In this we have the dogs, which you can call as the subject of the preposition, and then you have the mammals, which is the predicate. So, what is this distribution is all about? That means if you consider a preposition, the terms that are there, the subject and predicate, whether that particular term actually represent the entire class of that particular term. For example, the example that we have already taken, all dogs are mammals. So, if you consider this particular preposition, this is a universal affirmative preposition. All dogs, universal, are mammals, affirmative, positive sentence, right. So, if you consider this particular statement here, it says that all dogs are mammals. So, when you consider the term dogs, it represents all the dogs that are there in this particular world, in this particular universe. So, that particular term dogs, it represents the entire class. All dogs are mammals, each and every dog is a mammal. Let us consider it in the other way. If you consider it and if you are stating like that, all mammals are dogs, is that right? That is not right. Dogs is just a part of the entire class of mammals. So, that particular term that is mammals, that is actually not representing the entire class. That means the entire mammals are not dogs, but the entire dog class is mammals. So, in that case, in this particular preposition, this dogs or the subject term is what is distributed, right. So, this is a universal affirmative preposition. So, universal affirmative preposition, if you consider that particular statement or preposition, it is the subject term that is what distributed. So, this is the basic idea of distribution. So, we have this idea in all the different 4 types of preposition. So, you must have a proper idea about this particular term, distribution of terms, this particular phrase. Only then you can understand this illicit major and illicit minor. That is why I have mentioned that particular idea here. So, if you consider the A type preposition, that means the universal affirmative preposition, there what is the term which is distributed? That is the subject term. That is what I have already mentioned. All dogs are mammals is a universal affirmative preposition or a universal affirmative statement, where the dogs is the term which is distributed because it represents the entire class, right. So, A type universal affirmative preposition is called as the A type preposition. In that particular statement, which is the term that is distributed? That is the subject term. Then consider the next type of preposition, that is E type preposition. E type preposition stands for universal negative preposition. In that particular case, which are the terms that are distributed? Both the subject term and the predicate term. So, let us consider an example like this. No birds are fish, or no fish are birds. So, if you consider this particular example, both the birds and the fish represents the entire class. No birds are fish, likewise no fish are birds as well, right. So, in this particular example, these subject term and the predicate term, both the terms represents the entire class. That means in universal negative preposition, both the subject term and the predicate term are distributed. So, this is the basic idea behind this distribution of terms. Then you have I type preposition, which stands for particular affirmative, in which we have no terms distributed, and I type preposition does not distribute any terms. And finally, we have O type preposition, which stands for particular negative, in which we have the predicate term, that is what distributed. So, in order to understand the illicit major and illicit minor, what you have to need is you have to understand the idea of distribution of terms. That is why I have mentioned all these ideas here. So, please do remember this thing: A type preposition can distribute only the subject term, E type preposition distribute both the subject term and the predicate term, then you have I type preposition that does not distribute any terms, and finally we have the O type preposition that only distributes the predicate term. Now we are moving to the illicit major and illicit minor, the two important formal fallacies. So, what are the things we have discussed so far? We have discussed about the features or the rules of a valid argument. Then we mentioned that this particular illicit major and illicit minor, what is the fallacy happening there? There is a rule like this, we have already mentioned it here, that is the term that is not distributed in the premises cannot be distributed in the conclusion. This is an important feature of a valid argument. If an argument violates this particular rule, that results in the fallacies illicit major or illicit minor. So, distribution is what happens, or distribution of the terms is a key word or the term that we have to understand in order to get a sense of illicit major and illicit minor. That is why we have discussed about the terms that are distributed in the 4 basic types of categorical prepositions as well. Now we are moving to the first formal fallacy that we are going to discuss in this particular video, that is illicit major. So, let us consider the definition that is given here. Illicit major is a formal fallacy committed in a categorical syllogism that is invalid because its major term is undistributed in the major premise but distributed in the conclusion. What is our rule? A term that is not distributed in the premise cannot be distributed in the conclusion. That is our rule. But what happens in an illicit major? The major term is undistributed in the major premise, but it is distributed in the conclusion. I will just show you an example. If you consider this particular syllogism, first we have to identify the different terms. So, if you consider this particular syllogism, it has 3 prepositions. The first 2 can be called as the premises and the last preposition is our conclusion. Alright. So, the subject of the conclusion can be called as the minor term. The predicate of the conclusion can be called as the major term, and we have another term which is the middle term. So, how can you identify the middle term of a syllogism? Middle term is actually present in both the premises, but it will be absent in the conclusion, or this middle term is what leads us to a conclusion. So, if you consider this particular example here, you can see that dogs is a term which is present in both the premises, but that is absent in the conclusion, right. So, in this case we can say that dogs is the middle term. So, this is what you have to understand in the first place. So, we have identified the various terms in this particular syllogism. We have the minor term here, that is cats, or the subject of the conclusion. Mammals is the predicate of the conclusion, that is called the major term. And then we have another term which is present in both the premises but it is absent in the conclusion. We call it as the middle term. Okay. So, now we are moving to the next idea. So, if you consider this particular conclusion here, no cats are mammals. No cats are mammals is basically a universal negative proposition, right. Universal negative proposition. When we have discussed about the distribution of terms, we have already said that in universal negative proposition, in E type proposition, which are the terms that are distributed? Both the subject term and the predicate term are distributed in a universal negative proposition. That is why we have marked it here. Okay. So, cats and mammals are distributed in the conclusion. But if you consider this particular syllogism here, you can see that this mammals is distributed in the conclusion, but it is not distributed in the premise. So, the premise which contains this major term can be called as the major premise, and the premise which contains the minor term can be called as the minor premise. Cats is the minor term. So, here you have cats, so that is your minor premise, and mammals is your major term. So, this is the premise which contains this particular major term. So, we call it as the major premise. Alright. So, again I will explain. So, if you consider this particular conclusion here, this is a universal negative preposition. So, both the subject term and the predicate term are distributed in the conclusion. But what is the problem here? This major term that is mentioned here, mammals, this is distributed in the conclusion, but that is not distributed in the premise. Major premise. Why is it not distributed? Because all dogs are mammals is a universal affirmative preposition. In universal affirmative preposition, only the subject term is distributed. The predicate term is not distributed, or it is undistributed. Right. So, what happens here? The major term is undistributed in the major premise, but it is distributed in the conclusion. Again, read the definition that is given here. Illicit major is a formal fallacy committed in a categorical syllogism that is invalid because its major term is undistributed in the major premise but distributed in the conclusion. So, that is what happens here. The major term here is mammals, that is not distributed in the major premise, but it is distributed in the conclusion. So, what is a fallacy that happens in this particular argument? That is illicit major. Okay, so that's all about illicit major. Now we are moving to the next type of fallacy that we are going to discuss, that is illicit minor. Consider the definition here. Illicit minor is a formal fallacy committed in a categorical syllogism that is invalid because its minor term is undistributed in the minor premise but distributed in the conclusion. Same idea, but what's the difference? In illicit major, it is the major term, and in illicit minor, it's the minor term. That's it. So, consider this particular syllogism which is given here. All cats are felines, all cats are mammals, therefore all mammals are felines. Consider the conclusion here. All mammals are felines. The subject of the conclusion is the minor term, right. So, this is the premise in which we have the minor term. So, we call this all cats are mammals as the minor premise. Felines is our predicate of the conclusion. So, we call it as the major term, and the premise in which we have this particular major term, we call it as major premise. Alright, consider the conclusion here. All mammals are felines. So, this particular conclusion is a universal affirmative preposition, right. So, what is the term, or which is the term that is distributed in a universal affirmative preposition? That is the subject. We have already discussed that. A-type preposition. In A-type preposition, it is the subject term that is distributed, right. So, mammals is the subject of the conclusion here that is distributed here, right. So, this is your minor term. Why is it your minor term? Because it is the subject of the conclusion. But consider the same term in the premise. If you consider this same term in the premise, this is your minor premise. Why? This particular minor term is present in this particular premise. So, we call this premise as the minor premise. What is the problem here? In minor premise, this mammals is not distributed, but in conclusion, this term is distributed. Coming back to the definition. Illicit minor is a formal fallacy committed in a categorical syllogism that is invalid because its minor term is undistributed in the minor premise but distributed in the conclusion. This is your minor premise. In that particular minor premise, the minor term of this particular syllogism, that is undistributed, but that same term is distributed in the conclusion. If that happens, then comes or there appears the fallacy of illicit minor. So, please do remember the rule that we have already discussed. A term that is not distributed in the premises cannot be distributed in the conclusion as well. So, this particular fallacies, illicit major and illicit minor, what happens here? The term that is not distributed in the premises is distributed in the conclusion. If that is the major term, that is illicit major, and if it is a minor term, then it is illicit minor. That's it. So, I hope this idea is now clear for you. Now, we are moving to the questions that were asked from this particular area in the previous exam. So, this question was asked in December 2020 and June 2021 cycles, and the question goes like this. Identify the fallacy committed in the argument. You have a fallacy, you have an argument given here. You have to find out the fallacy which is committed here. What is the argument? Some birds are not beautiful creatures. All dogs are beautiful creatures, therefore no dogs are birds. I have just taken that argument here. So, if you consider the argument here, in the first premise, some birds are not beautiful creatures, is a particular negative argument or premise or proposition, right. Some birds are not beautiful creatures. In a particular negative proposition, it is the predicate which is distributed. Second premise, all dogs are beautiful creatures. All dogs are beautiful creatures is a universal affirmative proposition. In universal affirmative proposition, which is the term that is distributed? That is the subject term, right. Coming to the conclusion, no dogs are birds. No dogs are birds. So, if you consider this particular proposition here, this is a universal negative proposition. In universal negative proposition, both the subject term and the predicate term are distributed. Again, if you consider this dogs, this is the minor term. This particular minor term is distributed in the conclusion and that is distributed in the minor premise as well. So, there is no problem. Then consider this particular term birds. This is the predicate of the conclusion. So, we call it as the major term that is distributed in the conclusion, but what is the problem here? That is undistributed in the major premise. So, what is the problem here? Illicit major. So, consider the options here: fallacy of exclusive premises, fallacy of illicit process of major term, fallacy of the illicit process of minor term, fallacy of the undistributed middle term. So, what is the right answer here? Fallacy of illicit process of major term, or you can simply call it as illicit major. So, the right answer here is option B. Next question, this was again asked in the same exam. Name the fallacy committed in the argument. All dogs are mammals, no cats are dogs, therefore no cats are mammals. Take this argument. If you consider this argument, you have three different propositions, you have two premises and a conclusion, and if you consider the conclusion here, this is a universal negative proposition. In universal negative proposition, you have both the subject term and the predicate term are distributed, right. So, cats here is the subject of the conclusion, so we call it as the minor term. So, the minor term here or in the conclusion, this particular term cats is distributed and it is distributed in the minor premise as well. So, no issues. Consider this particular term mammals. Mammals is a predicate of the conclusion. So, that is our major term. So, this particular mammals appears here. So, this is our major premise. So, this particular term mammals is distributed in the conclusion. So, major term is distributed in the conclusion, but that is not distributed in the major premise. In this particular premise is all dogs are mammals. It is a universal affirmative proposition. In that particular proposition only the subject term is distributed. That is what we have already learned. So, in that case the term mammals is distributed in the conclusion, but it is not distributed in the premise. A term that is not distributed in the premise cannot be distributed in the conclusion as a rule, and in this particular case it is about the major term, right. So, what is the answer? Obviously option B, illicit major. So, the right answer for this question is option B. So, in this video we have discussed the two important types of formal fallacies, illicit major and illicit minor. We have other fallacies as well. So, if you consider that questions that we have discussed, you might have seen various options in which they have mentioned various types of fallacies. So, if you would like to know more about these fallacies, we have detailed classes about these topics in our classroom as well as in our LMS platform. So, if you like to join with Appleby Academy for your NET preparation, we are so happy to help you. So, we have a platform, an online platform, learning management system, where we are providing the learning resources in different modes. We have detailed notes available there. So, pre-recorded video classes are available. So, the PPTs that we are using in our video classes will be also uploaded there, and you have a test paper session where you can practice the test paper in exact NTA software format as well. So if you would like to ask, or if you have any doubts, you can contact our educators through the doubt clearance session as well. And apart from this, we are also providing live interactive sessions. So if you are a person who would like to join classroom classes rather than online classes, we have our classroom classes also available. So the admissions are open now. So if you would like to join us, or if you want to know more about our courses, you can just contact to the number that is given in the description box. So thanks for watching and happy learning.